I guess we should start with the reflective questions, which I'm going to copy paste and put them back in the chat so we can all see them at once. And I want to just pass the baton over to you guys. Let's go through each of these. There's only 3. I'm asking everyone now. This is me asking you. Are you already using any elements of the lexical approach in your classroom? I'm waiting for answers. Yes, cool. We're getting yeses. Cool. We're getting a good question. Thanks, Gabby. How do we know? Well, this is a good, okay. I'm going to start with, I'm going to go for the yeses first. This is really good to see. And then we're going to go to the mysterious question at the end. Okay, Tatiana, how are you using the lexical approach in your classroom? Are you? Yes, it works great with beginners. Yes, I agree. So Tatiana, are you using it are you approaching everything lexically, or are you just sort of integrating the lexical approach into other approaches, or through just the course book?
Because actually I'm very passionate about lexical approach, and I realized that I can build my whole class around teaching chunks and focusing on lexis and just those kind of real life situations and real life phrases when I'm teaching kind of beginners and maybe intermediate students. But when it comes to advanced students, that's where I have a big problem, because sometimes I feel that we are being distracted by the language. And we're kind of missing the idea of the whole text or the whole complex structure. And actually, I'm trying to combine teaching grammar, because when I'm having my students for several years, right, it means that they should be ready with all the terminology the grammar books offer, so that later their kind of transition to kind of more advanced language acquisition would come smoother, right? So that is why I have that dilemma, and I put that in the Q&A section. That well, do you have any ideas how we can still use that in a classroom? If you can share some of your experience.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. With advanced students, I mean, I feel that advanced students are even more of a sort of golden opportunity for lexical learning, lexical teaching, because I feel that they don't need, they become less reliant on the grammar. I don't know if maybe our teaching contexts are different, but I find that advanced learners don't need to utilize a sort of grammatical approach in order to advance. And I'm wondering what your thinking is about still providing grammar for your advanced students. How are you finding it? It sounds like you've got a clash, right, between a sort of grammatical approach and a lexical approach. Is that a fair comment?
Well, kind of. It's not a clash. I'm just looking for the kind of the right combination so that I can satisfy kind of both needs of my language learners. Because when we are getting to kind of longer text, more complex structures, right, they cannot just deal with those simple sentences. They really want to find kind of the way to accuracy as well as fluency. And that's when we are getting kind of stuck sometimes. Because I know that they should probably use that particular chunk of language, but how do I know that each of my students need this particular chunk? Right? If you understand what I mean,
right?
Because they have their own minds to express.
Right. Okay. I'm not entirely sure about what the issue is. I mean, are you saying that it's difficult to extract chunks from texts?
No, it's easy, but you know, when we are having kind of simple topics like introductions, greetings, right, job interviews, then we know exactly what the students might benefit from.
Hmm.
But when we're talking about kind of expressing their individual thoughts and ideas,
Hmm.
right? Well, first of all, they try to be very inventive and they create their own language sometimes, and you know how it sounds.
Where it's
It's not
possible, they're
just
not.
enjoyable, happy,
Yes,
oh, well, birthday. It would be something more complicated.
of course, of
And
course.
right, so that's the point.
Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, so I mean, just off the top of my head, I'd go for a sort of a two-pronged approach there. On the one hand, obviously, the reason why they're coming up with this sort of unnatural sentences is probably something. I mean, a good solution to that is just more and more exposure. And of course, we can't just give them all the writing, all the reading that has ever existed in English ever. But we can start kind of compartmentalizing things into different genres. So, I mean, what, what, whatever context we're in, whatever sort of speaking language context we're in, it fits into some sort of genre, whether we're discussing, classic examples, films and so on, but gossip. What are the functions of the language context? What are the reasons for people, and what are the relationships between the people? So for each of these, if you can identify different ones of those where the students are having trouble expressing themselves, and then find like readings or listenings with that, or transcripts, and find some input for them where that's fitting into the same sort of genre, that would help them, because then again they have something they can use to identify chunks and identify the sort of language being used. That was my first approach on that. Did that make sense? I just want to check before I move on to the second.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
thank
cool.
you.
And the second one is just error correction. I depend a lot on error correction in my classrooms, because it's not just error correction in the sense of things that are grammatically wrong, but I make sure that I make notes. I mean, I've got pages and pages and pages of students' errors that I keep in books, and I write as the students are speaking. And I put down stuff that is an error because it's not natural or not probable, as Mike Lewis would put it. And then just drawing attention to the errors. And I know that doesn't, it's kind of picking things out one by one, which is a bit of a nightmare. But it's not language. With language, we're not very free. This is something that lexical teaching has taught me. We have quite rigid structures. It's not just what's possible, but what's probable as well. So just by picking out like little like expressions, and you expressed this wrong, this is probably a bit more of a natural way to say this is a more natural way to say that, and bit by bit, chunk by chunk, the students will build a more competent and natural sounding sort of idiolect. Yeah, so recapping, providing lots and lots of inputs so they could discover it themselves, but also pointing out, letting them notice their problem, why they sound unnatural, and then providing them with alternatives. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I also believe that when it comes to the lexical approach, that says that it's really like based on learning prefabricated language that exists, that native speakers speak and use, and so because often students do not understand why what they are saying is not correct, and what's the reason, but what's the answer to that? And often there is no the answer is that there is no answer. You need to learn it, you need to accept it, because it is what it is. And this is because of those because of that prefabricated language that we need to learn as language learners. So
yeah, I agree. And yeah, I think that I just want to reiterate the fact that I think it's what you're saying as well, Hedy, is there is actually quite a limit of things we can say in certain situations. We have a script in English, and we sort of semi-improvise the script. So it may seem like a vast, never-ending like mountain of vocab and phraseology, but there's only a bit of it that we actually need. So that could be reassuring.
Yeah.
Cool. I hope that answered your question, Tatiana. We have so many questions. This is great. I'm just going back to the chat, and I'm just going to say, so yes. So Tatiana said yes. The second yes is from Michael Lynch. Yes was to the question, are you already using any elements of the lexical approach in your classroom? Michael, would you like to share your experience on that?
I just teach individuals. I don't teach in groups, so not all the things are there, but I teach a lot in, I use a lot of music, a lot of other things to use collocations. I've got a mixed bag of students from 15 up to 70. And it's the easiest thing for me. It's why I do it, because I like it, and it seems to work out, and I get the best response, the best feedback from the students doing it. I've only been teaching for a year, so it's not that I know any other way, but I've been doing this a lot.
That's great. So do you sort of seek out texts where the students can identify collocations and chunks?
I do. I look for things that are interesting for me. So I find books that I find interesting, or articles that I find interesting. Music, depending on the person, I use music that is interesting for them. Sometimes I don't like it, and that's okay. But I particularly look for words that they might want to use in their lives. If I'm talking to somebody who wants to travel, I tend to use a lot of that. For people who are working in IT, or people who are working in, I'm trying to think now, patents, for example. I have a couple of clients doing that, so I try to find things that are relevant to them. And project management, that's a big one. I picked a lot of material out of that because it seems to apply for a lot of people across the board.
This brings up a really good point, and it relates to what we were talking to Tatiana about, and that's again this sort of idea of a script, because I'm sure you're finding that when you're getting specific with things like project management and patents and so on, you're getting language repeating itself over and over again, right?
Yeah, constantly. It's well, I've been a salesman for 30 years, so everything about sales is about scripts. And we have a saying is that if you can feel comfortable with, if you can, when you have your script of what you're going to say, you don't really have to think too much about your own words. You can concentrate on the person and concentrate on the emotion of the interaction. And so I'm trying to get that feeling for them, where they can focus on the phrases and give them confidence that they'll be able to use those phrases again, that they'll understand them when a native speaker is using them.
Right. I like this analogy as well. Learning a language is like becoming a salesman. I can see similarities there.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. That was great input there. Thanks a lot, Michael. I'm going to move on. How do we know, asks Gabi, how do we know we're integrating elements of the lexical approach in our classroom? That's a mysterious question. I mean, if you know what the lexical approach is, then you can see that you're using it, surely. I don't know if you had something else, another sort of angle on that, Gabi.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I really just wanted to stay put today, but the topic is so interesting.
Oh, it's great, isn't it? I love this one.
I mean, how I was really, this is just a quick clarification. How I meant was, if I teach, I think I put it in the chat box somewhere. If I teach vocabulary through the PPP approach, and I teach connotations, collocations, colligations, and whatnot, is this already the lexical approach?
Yes.
This is why I'm asking, how do I know that I'm actually using the lexical approach?
Well, it sounds like you are, if you're sort of approaching it from that point of view.
I'm just teaching, I'm just using the PPP approach. That's what I'm doing.
Yes. So the PPP approach, I guess, I mean, Lewis talks a little bit like sort of negatively about the PPP approach, but I think that's not entirely fair to PPP because it all depends on that first P. By the way, PPP is this presentation, practice, production. You present language, students practice it in sort of controlled environment, and then they start using it. This is a sort of very, this has been around for a long time, and the communicative language approach. I know you knew that, Gabby. I was just making sure everyone was on the same page. But I guess it depends on that first P, doesn't it? Like when I think of, and I think this is what Lewis is thinking, when he's thinking of the PPP, and when I sometimes think of PPP, that presentation is very often a grammar presentation. And it's very often abstract and without context. And that, I think, is the sort of issue that a lot of people who are advocates of lexical learning have with PPP, because they think about that first P. But what you're describing here, to me, sounds like your first P is not that, it's contextualized.
Well, I guess,
language.
Gabriel, it's the P in the communicative classroom, which essentially is presenting language in the communicative way, very often through the guided discovery. So really, my issue, because it's not like I'm against the lexical approach. I just don't see it as an approach that you could use exclusively. So I see it more like something that we have already, we all do it on a daily basis. It's just that, yeah, but well, to different extent, I guess. But it's not something, I mean, I can't even imagine a course book, a syllabus based on the lexical approach. I mean, what would be, how would you define a syllabus based on the lexical approach?
Well, that's still something that hasn't been fully developed, I think, as far as I've found. But again, it's an approach. It's not a methodology or a method. Well, it's an approach, not a method.
So let me, if I may, sorry, so what exactly changes, Gabriel, when I use the lexical approach in the classroom? Because if it's not something that, if I don't have the syllabus, if I can do my presentation in a communicative way, I'm already including the elements of the lexical approach. What exactly is different in my teaching? What changes when I start using this lexical approach?
Yeah, good question. So one of the main things that I found was really insightful was this idea of removing this sort of dichotomy between grammar and vocabulary, for example, and seeing like language as a spectrum between this grammaticalized lexis thing, right? So you have things that are very inflexible and they're just basic phrases or single words. And then on the other side, you have things that are flexible but are still sort of lexically based. Whereas if we don't pay attention to that, we may be stuck with a sort of older binary thinking, that this sort of more Chomskyan approach of language is simply a machine and then we fill it with grammar, with vocabulary. And I think especially further down the line, this can cause problems with the SLA process and can slow down the process. So what I'm saying is, like, what you're doing in the classroom is one thing, but everything is geared towards raising awareness in the students about how language works, because most students around the world, especially, at least in my experience, have been taught very traditionally, and that grammar is one thing and vocabulary is another thing, and we must learn the grammar, and grammar is central to language. So the lexical approach sort of liberates us from that. And this is all very meta, I'm aware of that. And on a sort of granular level, then you may not see any differences, like apparent differences in the classroom, but it's about your entire approach and how you teach your students to look at the language. Did that help?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, look, I have about 20 other questions, but because this is something that I don't really feel like there is an answer to some question, to some of some of my questions.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe someone else wants to speak. I mean, Tatiana has just responded. Tatiana, did you want to tell me what you've just put in the chat box?
So nice to see other people's voices. That's why I really enjoyed the conversation. And
Yeah.
I'm so bad at typing, right? I have to use all those kind of crazy, right, ways of putting, right, my thoughts on paper. So the point is that usually we cannot just kind of concentrate on one particular approach, right? And think that that is kind of the only possible one. But my experience is then we're using lexical approach with students. We should not actually think that much about, right, whether we have studied that particular grammar structure or sentence structure or syntax, right, with the students. Sometimes that's not important for them, right? So we just give them that chunk of language, they learn it, they start using that because you have that particular topic, right? Or you have that particular kind of idea to express. But when we get right to the grammar right point in our syllabus, right, when we have to talk to them about passive or some clauses, then, right, what we have already done, right, comes very handy. So we kind of remind our students about the collocations or the collocations we have practiced before, and then the topic goes smoothly, right? They're so comfortable. They do not look at that particular structure as very complicated, right? So, and I guess it was you who said that drilling does magic, right? So I'm becoming more and more kind of aware that actually drilling and roting is really important for the students as well, right? Without repetition, without making that collocation or colligation your own, right, it wouldn't work. And if you get to the chat, I also kind of suggested a few ideas I'm using, and I also believe, right, that it is part of the lexical approach, right? So that's about the jazz chants when we're rhyming certain things and we're putting the tune to kind of add to what we are learning and making it memorable. And the same with the vocabulary logs, right? So I remember I talked about the advanced students, that they need their own kind of chunks and collocations, so that I offer them to run their vocabulary logs. So they're combining them. The only thing that sometimes I recommend them to do that in kind of columns. So here are kind of the verbs, here are the adjectives, here are the adverbs, and that's how you can probably choose from each column or from each category to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I understand all this and I buy all this. I think I'm just against using certain terminology or kind of putting this terminology to my kind of daily practice because as I said, I mean, the moment you teach vocabulary with in collocations, this is already teaching chunks. The moment you start teaching functional language, this is already teaching chunks. The moment you teach grammar patterns as chunks, as we all do, that's teaching chunks. So you teach the present perfect, you teach conditionals, you teach many different grammar points this way. But I'd never call it the lexical approach. I just call it teaching language. And you see, with the lexical approach, I feel like maybe what's missing is the fact that, like, when you learn grammar, grammar is never learned by combining smaller units into larger units, but by breaking longer units down into smaller units, right? So it's analytic. The process is analytic. And maybe this is something that's missing. I don't know if you are familiar with the Callan method.
I've used Callan myself. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see, now there is a problem with this method because once students get to the intermediate level, they hit the wall. Okay, they have to kind of undo the damage. They have to go back to the basic, and they actually have to study grammar us do it as in an analytical way. So this is my issue with the lexical approach.
Mm-hmm. I think this is where you differ with Mike Lewis. I think Mike Lewis specifically, sorry, I've got a helicopter, I'm going to close the door. Mike Lewis specifically disagrees with the statement that you have to go analytical onto a small scale. Now, I'm not saying that I completely support it either. I'm talking today about what it is, what the advocates of it propose. And yes, I think this is where you differ, because at many points when you were describing your process, Gabi, you were saying that you were describing things that do sort of gel with the lexical approach. And this brings us to the second question of the reflections about it. No, sorry, it's not there. About it being compatible with CLT. But where the approach differs from your approach, I think, is this idea about having to analyze at a granular level.
And also, like, for me, is that the lexical teaching, lexical approach is concerned, less concerned with output. You know, like when you use the communicative approach, then you really try and make students speak, even beginner students, as much as possible. But here in the lexical approach, I mean, we do not necessarily have teacher-dominated classrooms, but students may participate through speaking, but also by listening, noticing, or even reflecting. And that's also part of the output, which is not necessarily verbal, but still accepted. So this is again something that, yeah, and that's why I agree with Tatiana, who said previously that we just need to incorporate various methods and you know, try and, let's say, it may work better with higher level students, or one method may work better with higher level students, other with lower level students. But yeah, it's not necessarily just one.
Yes.
Looking to that.
Yes, and I think it's important to note that there's nothing, you know, some people really do benefit from grammar, like looking at the grammar, but I think the main thing I'm proposing today, and it's something I personally believe in a lot, is that assimilation before analysis. Let's look at the grammar, cool, let's do it. But make sure the students are sort of quite comfortable using it first. Maybe not perfectly, but at least in some sort of contextual way. I think that reflects what Hedy was saying too. Okay, shall I move on to the second? We're only on the second one. The second question, the second reflective question, we've done, actually. We've talked about that. And we've just talked about the third one. How do you feel about teaching grammar directly? Do you think there's still a place for it? Yeah, everyone knows my opinion on this, and we've discussed this a little bit. Have we got any more questions in the chat? We've got.
Yes. We do have from, for example, Henrika. Henrika, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, on behalf of Henrika, I'm a colleague of hers, and we are sort of doing this workshop together. Well, the question is, we work with a lot of young learners, and we find it quite difficult to sort of work through chunks in a systematic way. So is there any list so that we make sure that we cover the right categories instead of jumping from one to the other?
That's a great question. I'm going to just say I don't know, because I simply have almost no experience with young learners. I've been teaching adults. It's my blind spot. I wish I could answer you. I really wish I could. I'm just trying to think, is there somewhere that I would know where to go to look for that, or someone who would be, I don't know any specialists, lexical learning specialists who also specialists in young learners. So,
and what about adults? If I may interrupt you, what about, do you have lists with?
Well, that's always tricky. Okay, so the whole concept of a list, because we covered this a little bit with Tatiana near the beginning of the Q&A session. like a straight up list would be a little bit strange, because so much of the approach is based on context and like, you know, the function of the language and why you're using the language. So I would say that a better approach than finding a simple list is to find the language in context as much as possible. What are your students' goals? What kind of context do they need to use their language in? Find texts, audio texts, reading texts, conversations, anecdotal experience. Even make something up if you feel you could like write something quite natural, but let it sort of gravitate towards the genre. Let it gravitate towards why the students are learning language. I said it before, but I'll say it 1,000 times because it's quite an overlooked thing. We're not free with language, and when we communicate, our settings dictate quite strongly what we say. So if you can find enough, like, sort of corpora, enough text, enough body of language for specific situations and specific goals that match your students' goals, you will find the list. It'll be right there. But more importantly, the list will be in context. And I think that's, personally, I would say that's a better approach than just a straight up list.
I agree with you. I agree with you that is better, and it also uses input in a very nice way. Mm-hmm. At the same time, sometimes you're just thinking, am I not skipping anything? You know? So then something like a backup, a list would just help to make sure that the things that you present your students with, well, at least has a bit of structure.
Even a list will be missing something because English is gigantic. That's why I sort of want to focus on genres and specific situations as possible, because that's the only way we can really uncover it. I don't think there is a comprehensive list of intermediate chunks, because that list would just be like huge.
Yeah, I think it would help younger students if you had, let's say, 2 or 3 chunks for greeting, 2 or 3 chunks for talking about sort of hobbies, 2 or 3 chunks for telling something about the place where they live. And of course, you can find that in context and in all sorts of elements that you present them with. At the same time, time is precious, so it would also sort of save a bit of time, and well, you would have different things.
In that case, I'd like to tie things round to what Gabi was saying earlier, and it's this whole thing of like, aren't we already doing this sort of angle? And that's the list will be in course books. If you go to a sort of any language course book that's been written after 1992, you'll find them there, because that's what course books have been doing for the past sort of 40 years, is taking language from context. But there will always be something missing.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks very much.
Hey, thanks a lot. That was a good question. I liked it.
Yes, Gabi is suggesting that actually teachers can create their own list of chunks, which I agree with. Absolutely, because we know the level of our students, what they really need based on their needs analysis, and we can just also make an effort, to do so. And I think when it comes to higher level students, and Tatiana has previously that it's really tricky when you have a larger text to select chunks that really is like everybody needs, that is suitable for everybody. We never know what individual students need at a higher level necessarily, but if we train them to recognize chunks, then I think it's really beneficial, because then they can do the job themselves outside the classroom as well.
Yes, this is such a good point. I guess it hasn't been stressed enough. The whole way I approach the lexical approach in this presentation, I think this is really, really golden advice, is empowering the students to do it themselves, because the higher the level, the less they need you. Our jobs as teachers is to make sure our students don't need us anymore. And yeah, that's a great point, Hedy. I couldn't have made it better myself.